Welcome. I am Pamela Riker, Director of Classical Tuesdays in Old Town Tacoma. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we are happy to perform virtually, if not in our usual Slavonian Hall. For this March 2021 event, Tacoma composer Greg Youtz has written a group of songs based on poems written by Tacoma poet Josie Emmons Turner. These poems reflect her reactions and actions during the pandemic. Our musicians for this premiere performance are soprano Cyndia Sieden, mezzo-soprano Sue Cho, and pianist Oksana Ejokina. Listen as Josie discusses and reads her poems, and Greg explains some of his approach to setting the poems to music, followed by a performance of Songs for the Spring of Waiting.
Well, greetings, Josie. It's great to see you online. I
Hi,
wish I,
Greg.
I wish we were in person, but we all know what's going on. So here we are in the privacy of our own houses. um, so I got to know you way back in the late 90s when you were the arts manager for the city of Auburn, and you
Oh
and
my
your
God.
conductor friend sort of single-handedly created a symphony orchestra for Auburn that still exists.
I had forgotten about that. That's yes.
So
That's right. That's when we met, right?
and then I don't know, probably 5 or 6 years later, I joined the Tacoma Arts Council, and lo and behold, you were now in the city of Tacoma doing somewhat the same thing. So that's how we met, and now we belong to various friend groups and things. So I see you fairly often. But go ahead and tell our audience a little bit about yourself and where you grew up and how you became a poet and an arts manager.
I grew up in California, and my dad was transferred to Seattle. He was in the insurance business in my senior year of high school. So I finished high school up in the Northwest. Um, I have been involved in writing poetry probably since I was maybe 11, 12 years old. It wasn't very good, but I have my mom gave me a diary and I just started writing. I also at the time was really interested in music and I love to write songs, and so I'd listen to like Bob Dylan and Joni Mitchell and all of the current, singer songwriter types, and that's basically how I started. Took many years later for a variety of reasons for me to really take my poetry seriously, and I ended up getting my Master's of Fine Arts with the first graduating class of the Rainier Writing Workshop at Pacific Lutheran University. And I think you know something about that school, right?
That is indeed where I teach music. Well, and then I remember one of the things that we did while I was on the Arts Council here in Tacoma was create the position of the Poet Laureate. And so a number of people have served as the Poet Laureate of the city of Tacoma. It's still a position today, but you were one of those people who was chosen to be the Poet Laureate. Tell us a little bit about that.
I think I was the fourth. I was the first poet laureate to be poet laureate for 2 years. At the time, I was doing events about once a month, not only in Tacoma, but throughout the state. I think one of the most hilarious things I did was on National Poetry Day, I put on a sandwich board and I rode the light rail up and down between Union Station and the theater district. And people would get on and off, and they'd have this crazy woman come up and hand them a poem.
That's great. And then you spent some time towards the end of your working life teaching
I did.
and sort of passing on literary traditions to the next generation. Tell us just a few sentences about that.
It was so rewarding and so fun to work with seniors and students of creative writing. I taught AP literature and seniors, like writing for college. And I also taught creative writing classes, and it's lovely to hear from former students to this day. And the students were a huge influence to me. So in my classes, when I'd have them write, I would just pull out my um, journal and I would write myself. And so I was modeling that writing process. And I was also modeling, okay, here's what I wrote. And then I'd show them revision after revision after revision. And when something finally got published, I'd show them that. And I think it really helped them understand that writing doesn't just happen, out of just, oh, I get a divine inspiration.
You and all of our audience lived through the big shutdown last March, just a year
Still,
ago,
yeah,
when suddenly everything in the world seemed to just stop. Schools closed, shops closed, social life closed. Of course, everything in my world, the music world, shut down.
yeah.
Universities closed. You sent some poems to one of our friend groups that seems to be kind of a spontaneous and rather quick response to this epic situation. Tell us just a little bit about whether it was typical for you to turn to poetry to express these kinds of things, or whether this was an unusual burst of creativity.
I write best when I'm left alone and I'm really quiet. And it was one of those times, as you know, I'm married to an artist, and my husband was going to his studio every day, leaving me at home with the four walls and my books. And it was this luxury that I had not experienced like ever in my life. And so it led me to really sit down and be able to write. And I made a daily practice of writing during that time when I could. And I'd take the dog out for walks, and I would walk like 2-3 miles and come home, and there was this eerie silence in the neighborhood that was unlike anything I could have ever imagined. And it was shocking. I mean, because there weren't even cars going up and down the street. And I think everyone was so glued to, what do we do? There were so many divergent voices in all of this, and nobody knew what direction to go. For me, I wrote a lot of poems. I think I've got maybe 19 in this collection. And initially I just started sending them out to friends groups, just to sort of say, this might just uplift your spirits or not, or there is life out there. And I also turn to things that really give me peace of mind, like walking and gardening and things like that. So yeah.
All right. Well, let's turn to the poems themselves. Once I saw some of the poems, I said, "Wow, I want to document this moment in music the way you documented it in poetry." And so I
And I
basically,
was gobsmacked when you wanted to do that.
well, I should tell our audience that I have met poets who want nothing to do with composers, because they know that the act of setting a poem to music is an incredibly powerful act. And it's possible for the music to overwhelm the poem. And if you do it badly, or if you do it in a way that the poet doesn't like, then you literally can do damage to poetry. So I basically asked your permission. Would you be okay with the idea of me maybe writing some songs? And once I think I wrote one and sent it to you and said, kind of like this.
Yeah.
And so yeah, so you liked the result, and so at that point, you and I worked together to kind of assemble a collection of 5. I thought that might be about the right amount,
Yeah.
and
That seems
you, of
like
course,
a good amount for a song cycle.
right.
Yeah.
And you may have, if you publish these 19 poems as a book or something, you probably will put them in a particular order that makes sense to you. But I have to think about musical journeys, musical arcs of energy and tension and things. And so I put them in the following order. March is the hardest time of year. The Class of 2020, Devil's Bargain, Homage, and Proctor Prayer. So let's take each one of those and just briefly, I'm going to invite you to essentially pretend that you're at a poetry reading. And
Okay.
so set up each of those poems for us and then just read it the way you would read it to your fellow poets.
Okay. Thanks, Greg. And it's an honor to have these put to music by you. So and I love what you did with them. The first one, March is the hardest time of the year. I think well, obviously I wrote this early in March, right after the shutdown. In the Northwest, I think March is always really difficult because it's either really pouring rain or it's too cold to do anything. But you see these little tendrils of spring coming up, and I was out mulling around my garden and thinking, oh, I'm ready. I'm ready to do this. And obviously the garden wasn't ready. There's a noise and silence. And sometimes when the silence is just, you don't even hear a bird, the silence is deafening. I got to really thinking and listening to what was happening. And between that and the seasons, I think that was my inspiration and my jumping off point for this poem. The title of the poem actually works out to be the first line of the poem also. March is the hardest time of the year. Not quite real spring, as winter's north air caused naked branches to shiver. Tree trunks expose all their imperfections. Nightshade engulfs, threatens young tulips, while dahlias still slumber in dark soil beds. The gardener paces, inspecting hardy fuchsias for any sign of baby green hope, while guilty squirrels scamper, bulb in cheek, deep into an evergreen hedge. Gravel paths crunch under her feet, claw trowel in hand. She pokes around rose roots, sprinkling fertilizer, clipping away last season's dead wood, listening for children or cars on her strangely quiet street. Like nesting birds protecting their young, all her neighbors are behind their blinds, closing out the air, the season, waiting for the virus, its poison contagion, to blow away and life to begin again.
So beautiful.
Thank you.
Okay, so
Yeah.
number 2, Class of 2020.
I taught seniors. I had a couple of my AP students, one in particular, her name was Samantha, and she would text me or get online at all hours of the morning or night and just say, Turner, this is a bummer. Or Turner, I guess like we're not going to do softball, or Turner, they're canceling prom. Like, are we going to have graduation? And it was a cycle, which led me to think all of these thoughts fit into the form of a villanelle, because a villanelle in itself is a cycle and gets twisted around. And it evolved into this piece that I wrote titled For the Class of 2020. When you are 17, everything matters. That boy or girl who smiled at you, graduation, prom, those moments of wonderment, which surely a parent or a teacher would never understand. Could they even remember being young? For when you are 17, everything matters. Senior night, award ceremonies, that last paper to write, ever, at least in high school. For prom comes soon, promising memories. Or that is the way it should be, and you thought you were promised after 13 long school years, because when you are 17, everything matters. But this year, something called COVID stands in your way. Not your fault. And I agree, unfair. No prom. Just keep breathing. Keep wondering why. And that's okay. My mother used to say, "This too shall pass." But that's a lot to trust, you say, for when you are 17, everything matters. You long for prom, for moments of wonderment.
Good. And then we take a turn for the serious.
Yes. So I think many people are familiar with the Dorothea Lange picture, where it's black and white. She's sitting in the middle of this woman sitting in the middle of somewhere, I believe Oklahoma, and it's just the Dust Bowl, and she just looks absolutely famished. She's dirty, and she just has a sullen look on her of, where do I go? What do I do? I started looking back at I think this would have been maybe Aprilish, Mayish, when things started to get really political. And so I wanted to go back and look at the pictures of the Depression and the pictures of what happened in World War II, because it was such a time. I remembered my mother talking about it, how the country really came together and fused, and people gave up things, or they, if they had them, and really this country has been through so much previously, and it seemed like that kind of collective spirit had sort of dissipated in ways that were, for me, repugnant. And so and I looked at all kinds of research in the Depression, and recognizing that some people had it a lot better off than others. So, Devil's Bargain. Dorothea Lange, your photograph of a woman's soul grappling for survival awakens my midnights after keeping the late news on too long. Pundits predict a depression worse than 100 years ago, and there is argument over to work or to die, or dying due to work, a devil's choice. To make light, is it the chicken or her egg? If there are no people, there is no work, no eggs, no meat, no harvest. History, dear child, repeats itself in black and white. Stocks were always traded at night. Tips were always sold, while suits looked away with unabashed, unashamed hubris and pride, condemning parents whose children starved.
Well, and then in the next song, Homage, you go back to another crisis even earlier in American history. Tell us about the poem Homage.
This comes twofold. I have always loved Walt Whitman's work, and the work that the poems that he wrote, like Drum Taps and from the Civil War era, and recognizing what he did to make the Civil War real for people who were not affected by it. But I also had a very familiar and quiet rage. My cousin's husband is an emergency physician in Arizona. And he's, God bless him, been on the front lines of this since day one. And when I started looking at emergency rooms filling up and ICUs filling up and tents being put out, to hear what was going on in David's hospital and so many other hospitals around the country, of frontline workers being exposed to this virus and dying because they didn't have the proper protective equipment for it. I spent a couple of days rereading lots of Walt Whitman, and that became the sort of the genesis for this, and it's probably the most reworked poem of the collection. But I love what you did musically with this poem, and when the audience hears the rhythmic pieces that you added to this, I think it's stunning. It's magnificent. So thank you. Homage. No dainty rhymes or sentimental love verses for you, terrible year. Walt Whitman. Walt, you walked alongside soldiers in blue, and you now would salute those whose weapons, respirators, thermometers, stethoscopes, are carried so bravely and like the soldiers of your day, whose shoe soles grew thin, whose coats went threadbare. Modern day warriors approach each day missing what should be at the ready: PPE, gloves, masks. There is no time for sentiments. There cannot be dainty rhymes. There cannot be personal hunches. There cannot be poisonous injections. Instructions for Clorox. Walt, this terrible year, this terrible, terrible year of illness, of death. How have we failed to cradle our victims, to respect numbers, truth, science, to be loyal to one another, to be selfless, to be united as Americans? Walt, I see you in that sepia photo. You stroke your beard, adjust your waistcoat, shake your head, pat my hand, carry me across an electric shock of time.
All right, and then we have one more. Having reached, kind of the heights of rage and now kind of historical profundity and maybe almost despair, how do you end this thing? And so I return to a poem you wrote about your own neighborhood in North Tacoma, the Proctor district where you live. And so take us out with Proctor Prayer.
So Proctor Prayer is one of the poems that evolved as I would walk Charlie, my dog, up to the neighborhood and back and all around. And again, it comes from observations and being aware of what's around. And I love that neighborhood, and I love the intimacy and the friends that I've made in that neighborhood. I think the audience will mostly know all of these places, but in case somebody is listening to this or watching this from far away, the only thing that I would mention is the Met refers to the Metropolitan Market, which is a grocery store in the neighborhood. I think everything else will be pretty self-explanatory. Proctor Prayer, Spring 2020. Alfredo is standing outside, cooking pizza in his wood fire stove on wheels, his restaurant shuttered. I walk my dog, sniffing sausage, past Chef. He calls out a hearty, "Hello, darling, how are you?" Smiles are infectious. Safeway's parking lot is half full. People circle the Met. I buy a dozen roses, ashen damask, like my mother's old linen. Not exactly edible, but food for my soul, and continue walking. Mason School's soccer field is empty. Even the dogs are inside. Terry's Tavern is shuttered, but Garden Sphere is wide open, an outside business. It's too early for geraniums and too cold for basil, but sweet peas are starting. There is new life coming. A friend just welcomed a new granddaughter. Pink and blue hyacinths pepper my garden. Dear our birthing fawns, Mother Mary, may we all live to summer.
All right. Well, thank you so much, poet Josie Emmons Turner. I will now turn to a little bit about my process of turning these into songs, and then we will have the world premiere online of these 5 songs. Josie, thank you so much for talking with us. It's been delightful to see your face.
Thank you, Greg. It's so wonderful to see you. I look forward so much to the time when we can actually do these live for an audience. Won't that be fun?
It will indeed, and it will happen.
It's one of these days.
Okay, bye-bye.
All right, bye-bye. All right, Greg, thank you.
Well, so then the question is, how do I take a poem and turn it into a song? I should say that the original idea for this piece came to me before I found Josie's poems. I was looking for some sort of project for 3 of my former students to perform together, a soprano and a mezzo singer and a pianist. All of them are very good friends. They've been friends for, I don't know, 15 years probably, since they were first starting out in college. And they had been looking for something to perform. And so I said, well, I'll make something for you. By the time the pandemic hit, all of our lives had become very complicated. And so really none of them were able to commit to this kind of project at this time. But I decided that I was still very interested. And so when Josie sent her poems, I thought, aha, this is the project for a soprano singer, a mezzo singer, and a pianist. So what we're looking at here is the first of Josie's poems. March is the hardest time of the year. And what I'm showing you here is how I analyze a poem as a composer. At the very top up here, I wrote sotto voce, which means a kind of a whispered voice. You can see that I looked at this first line and I wrote some pitch notes along here, sort of making up a tune in my head, how I could sing this first line. In fact, the tune is a little different than this as it ended up, but that was my first draft. I also thought that I wanted something for this first tune that responded to Josie's comment that for her, March was eerily quiet. And I loved that word eerie. And so I decided to have a pitch that sort of rang, that was not really part of the main chord of the piece. It was sort of out there, like from a different dimension, and it wouldn't go away. And it just kept ringing like a bell. And so here I wrote slow musette. Now a musette is an 18th century dance form in which there's kind of a drone pitch that never changes. So that's what came to my mind, almost like a bell that keeps ringing. And it's invariant, it doesn't change. The key changes under it, but it just sits there. And I thought maybe a ninth. This piece ended up being an A minor, so there's a B, which would be the ninth above the A, that keeps ringing like this sort of bell that it's almost like a preoccupation. So my idea was that the soprano would be almost like the interior voice, worrying, concerned, preoccupied, unable to get the pandemic out of your mind, while the mezzo tries to go about her business and comments on the world around. And that's section 1. And then you'll see I came up with a section 2A, and I thought, okay, now the gardener is going to start puttering around. So I came up with theme B music, which putters around, and you'll hear it's very, very different. And then the same music, slightly different, so I call it 2B, sort of continues as she walks around and does various things. And then she suddenly begins listening for children on her strangely quiet street. And so that was sort of the end of that bustling section. And now we're back to the opening, where we're listening to these strange quiet and all of our neighbors hidden and closing out the air, and we're waiting for life to begin again. Down here I wrote Brahms Opus 118 number 6. That's a favorite piece of mine. I don't quite remember why I put it there, but it was a note to myself to think about that as a model. So that's just a bit about how I thought about this song before I began writing it. Here's the next song, and I'll just very briefly mention this. Josie mentioned this as a villanelle, which is a poetic form that involves the repetition of a line that keeps coming back at strategic points. The villanelle goes back to the French Middle Ages, basically. So it's a very popular old poem. Everybody knows what the form is. And so if you write a villanelle, it's kind of like, as Josie said, doing a puzzle as a poem. Everything's got to fit. So the repeating line is, when you are 17, everything matters. And here it is again, into the second verse. And then here it is again at the end of the fourth verse. And then at the very end here. And then she put one last line on to sort of take us out. Now, I decided that this, because it's about young people who do not understand the virus, they don't understand the lockdown, they don't understand why their lives are turned upside down. They want to be cool, they want to be brash, they want to be king of the hill, they're seniors. So I decided it should be jazzy, maybe a little skittery. There would be trills. I wrote here a flat 13th chord. That's a particular sort of jazz chord with which the piece begins, by the way. And that chord just keeps coming back a number of times, particularly at the beginning of every time this thing repeats. And some notes to myself on some chords. All right, so that is just a brief look at how I thought about this poem. The rest of it, I think, will be self-explanatory. The third poem, Devil's Bargain. Again, Dorothea Lange, the famous photographer of the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression, took some iconic American photos. And this was the poem that struck me as being really kind of dark rage at the entire system as sort of failing. And I decided also that it was time for the piano to have a solo. So this one begins with a piano solo. There's a lot of busy piano underneath all the way through, and then again at the end. The fourth poem, Homage, this is about, her relationship with Walt Whitman and sort of looking to Walt Whitman for ideas. And I decided to set this as a kind of a grim march. So you'll hear the piano sort of marching quietly in the background while the singers sing, "Oh, Walt, Walt." All right, so you'll hear that. And it gets sort of angrier and angrier as it goes on until finally the last verse. "Walt, Walt, I see you in that sepia photo." It's almost like calling out for help. "Walt, what do we do? Tell us what to do." And of course, the mentor doesn't tell us what to do, but serves perhaps as our calm inspiration. He strokes his beard, adjusts his waistcoat, and pats our hand. So that brings us to the fifth poem, Proctor Prayer, Spring 2020. I decided when I put this one last that it would bring us full circle back to where we started, our neighborhood, gardens, ordinary people, local places, businesses. So Alfredo runs a restaurant which is shuttered at the moment because of COVID, but he's standing outside cooking pizza. And I decided to give this a kind of an Italian folk song kind of quality. So you can imagine a gondolier singing this in Venice, if you like. We visit various places around the neighborhood. It appears okay through the second verse. And then in the third verse, we begin to realize that things are still empty and eerie. Even the dogs are inside. Businesses are shuttered. But the garden store is open. Aha. And that brings us back to the garden, which brings us back to flowers and deer, and then finally a prayer. "Mother Mary, may we all live to summer." And I decided at the end to bring back that sort of interior monologue voice from the very opening song, that obsession, that preoccupation that won't go away. So that comes back again in this song. And at the very end, because it's a prayer, we end with a kind of an unspoken amen. So let's listen to the world premiere of these 5 songs by poems by Josie Emmons Turner. I call the set altogether Songs for the Spring of Waiting.
'tis the hardest time of year, not quite real spring, as winter's north air cause naked branches to shiver. Tree trunks expose all their imperfections. Nightshade engulfs, threatens young tulips, while dahlias still slumber in dark soil beds. The gardener paces, inspecting hardy fuchsias for any sign of baby's green hope, while guilty squirrels scamper bulby cheek deep into an evergreen hedge. Gravel paths crunch under her feet, clock tower in hand, she walks around rose roots, sprinkling fertilizer, clipping away last season's dead wood. Listening for children on her strangely quiet street, like nesting birds protecting their young. All her neighbors are behind their blinds, closing out the air, the season waiting for the virus, its poison contagion, to blow away, and life to begin again. When you were 17, everything matters. That boy or girl who smiled at you, graduation, from those moments of wonderment. Surely a parent or teacher would never his wood fire stove on wheels. His restaurant shuttered. I walked my sausage-smelling dog past chef. He calls out, "Harvey, oh darling, how are you? S'mores are in fashion." Safeway's parking lot is half full. People circle the net. I buy a dozen roses, ashen damask, like my mother's old linen, accepted by the law, but food for my soul, and continued walking. Mason's soccer field is empty. Even the dogs are inside. Terry's tavern is shuttered. But Garden Spear is open, and outside business it's too